What you don't prepare yourself for and we have no context for is what happens if I go to war and I am somehow responsible for the harm or death of a comrade and I'm still alive. What do I do with that? I was somehow prepared, or I thought I was, to not come home. I was prepared to lose my life. I wasn't prepared for effectively my life as I knew it to be lost, but for me to physically still be breathing with all my fingers and toes.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Let's Give a Damn podcast. I'm your host, Nick LaPara, and you're here. Thanks for showing up. This is the podcast about people who give a damn, by people who give a damn, and for people who give a damn. This week's podcast conversation is pretty remarkable. My guest is Stephen Elliott. You've probably never heard of him before, but you have heard of the person that he most likely and mistakenly shot and killed while serving as an Army Ranger in Afghanistan after 9/11. That's all I'm going to say right now because I want Stephen to share his story. It's most definitely not my story to share. During this chat, we talk about his story, of course, but we also talk a bit about veteran care, caring for those that are actively serving in the military, PTSD, our current American military's global footprint, and whether or not we are being helpful, and so much more. So, because I don't want to give away too much, that's all I'm going to say. Let's get right into this conversation. So much to unpack. Here's my conversation with a damn-giving human named Stephen Elliott. Let's go. It's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Elliott to the Let's Give a Damn podcast. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's great to be here.
You came all the way from Olympia, Washington, just for this interview. Well, kind of. That's sort of the truth.
Yeah.
You know, one of our mutual friends introduced us.
Yes.
Mike. Mm-hmm. Mike Furbaugh.
That's right.
And we were just catching up before the mic went on about how we all know each other and it's a small world and they're wonderful people.
They are.
Mike, if you're listening, you better listen because you introduced us. If you're listening, know that we both love you and you and your family are awesome. So, Stephen, again, thank you so much for being here. Mm-hmm. We have a lot to cover. I'll start by highlighting that you have a book coming out on May 21.
Yes.
Our conversation will actually release next week. So people will have time, if they're interested in it, to go and pre-order that because pre-order sales are really good for authors. It proves a lot to the people watching the metrics, right? Watching the numbers.
Yeah.
But anyway, so May 21, your book comes out. It's called War Story, a Memoir. So let's do a couple things right now. Tell us about the book, but also it's your story, right?
Yeah.
And your story involves, your story kind of intersects with, people might not know about Stephen Elliott.
No.
They don't know about your book yet.
If they know about me, that's probably a little creepy.
Yeah, exactly, right? But I'm glad that they're getting to know you. But so they don't know about you yet, but they do know about a person that you interacted with, right?
Yes.
That they're going to know that story, right? And I don't want to give it away right now. I want you to sort of organically share it.
Yeah.
So as long as you want to take on that, take us through the book. You sent me you actually just handed me an actual copy of your book, which I'm very grateful for. Last week you sent me, what did you call it?
It was an advanced reader copy, but it was like an advanced reader copy.
Got it.
Which was sort of the high school bound report version of the book.
Yeah, it was pretty dope.
You have
I felt very lucky to get that copy.
Super beta test.
When this becomes a New York Times bestseller, I'll sell that on eBay.
There you go.
It said confidential on every page, like do not share. You just handed me a copy of your book, May 21. Why don't you just share your story? The book, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And take as long as you want. I'll interrupt here and there with some questions that I have. I read some of the book, didn't get a chance to read all of it. So go. Let's hear it all.
The upshot of it really is the book is just my own story of war. Sort of the context is I am from Central Kansas, grew up in the plains of Central Kansas, all my family, farmers, raised cattle, et cetera. And my grandfather, Hugo, was a veteran of World War II. And he spent a year and a half on the Italian front, came home after the armistice, and then proceeded to live his life as a farmer. And my folks were divorced shortly after I was born, and so he was very much the closest thing to kind of a dad I had in my life, and very much a father figure to me. And I sort of joke that as a kid, in my mind, every man over the age of 60 was two things. They were a veteran of World War II and Lutheran, because that's what I was surrounded with. Like, that was the community. Yeah. And so it was really normal. You kind of have this idea that there's all these people, just very unassuming, folks who came back, but who, in some form or fashion, their life was, their adult life seemed to start as men with military service. And so, as a kid, I played my share of G.I. Joe and sort of thought that's, maybe what I would do, and grew out of that, and ultimately thought I would pursue other things. And then 9/11 happened at the beginning of my junior year of college, and kind of just couldn't shake that, as far as this sense of, not unlike Pearl Harbor, that this was our generation's Pearl Harbor in some respects, and that all of those feelings of, in some respects, a desire to serve our country, and there's lots of ways you can serve our country. It doesn't just have to be a military uniform, but
sure, yeah.
But I think,
but that is one way.
It is one way, and so that was really strong. So there was definitely a desire to serve in the midst of that conflict, and then also very much honestly a sense of inadequacy. I felt, honestly, I would describe my decision to serve, in part, there was a selfless component to it, and then there was a very selfish component to it. I wanted to prove myself, and I felt that if I served in the military, if I went to war, and particularly if I served with a special operations unit, that I would prove to myself and the world that I was a man, and I wouldn't have to question that anymore. I'm blessed. My family is wonderful, and I was blessed with a lot of wonderful folks in my life growing up. So it's not that I didn't have support or have affirmation, but I felt that gap. Yeah. So 3 weeks after I graduated from college, I was in Fort Benning, Georgia, beginning Army basic training, and ultimately I had joined to serve in the Ranger Regiment. And so I went through that process. And ultimately was assigned. I completed, selection for the Rangers, and was assigned to 2nd Ranger Battalion in Fort Lewis, Washington, near Seattle, in 2003.
So let me interrupt you real quickly.
Yeah.
So you, in the book, you talk about how you just showed up one day and you didn't say, I want to be, an infantryman, or I guess I don't know how it works. I've never done it, but you could have asked for a variety of things, but you walked in and said, I want to be a Ranger, which is like, that's pretty.
It's hard.
Pretty hard, right? Like these are the guys that you see in the in the movies doing all the special things and all the special operations stuff. And so, how weird was that you asked to go for that versus like what do you want me to do? Like,
it was. And
what was driving your desire to go like all?
I had talked to some family. I had a cousin who he was a 30-year SF colonel. He was retired, and I talked to him a fair bit just to try and get a handle on what there is out there. But for me, it was just, I was finishing a business degree, and I saw the next 30 years of my life behind a desk kind of flash before my eyes, and it was just like, well, I can do that whenever. I can look at spreadsheets, I can consult whatever that is in an office. But again, it kind of goes back to that self-imposed rite of passage. Can I actually be a warrior? And that betrays a tremendous amount of naivete, because again, that's just one expression of being a warrior. There's lots of ways that we are invited into fighting for that which is true, that which is just, that which requires reform. You don't have to hold a weapon in your hands in order to do that. But that's where I was at. The calculus was really that going in enlisted, I could have gone as an officer. I went enlisted because that was the quickest path to special operations. So essentially, if I didn't recycle or get hurt, I could be assigned to the Ranger Regiment, which is a second tier. Like, it's a tier 2 special operations unit, the same as the SEALs. Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 are tier 1 units. And all those tier 1 units basically source their personnel from the tier 2 units, right? So it was, I would call it, without being disparaging, sort of quote unquote entry-level special operations. Sure. You can get in quickly, be operational quickly, and frankly, and this is, you got to laugh to keep from crying, I suppose, I didn't want to miss the war. And so, which there's a fair bit of Yeah, there's a looking 18 years on, which is just hard to wrap my mind around. Ranger Regiment, SEAL teams, special operators, those units have been continuously deployed for 18 years since 9/11. And so in my mindset at that time, I was like, well, they're going to find bin Laden tomorrow and this thing will all be over with, which that would have been fantastic for a lot of reasons.
Sure.
So that was a lot of my thinking was I could go in, do something meaningful, what I felt was meaningful anyway. And if I wanted to make a career out of it, that's a terrific foundation upon which to build a career, having started there. And if I didn't, if I wanted to do my 4 years and get out, I felt like I would have been able to not just spend, a bunch of time in a schoolhouse getting trained, but I would actually be able to do something and then move on to, whatever else life had for me. So that's sort of the summary of how I made that decision. But yeah, it was very clear that when I, quote unquote, marched into a recruiting station in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I was going to school, the recruiter was not used to talking to soon to be graduated business grads about joining the Rangers. So that was a unique conversation for him. And it became pretty clear at that point that this was a much more real step as opposed to a theoretical one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry for the interjection. I just wanted to sort of understand that framework. So keep going with your...
So anyway, I mean, I found myself, things were clicking along and made it through all the selection process, got assigned to 2nd Ranger Battalion in Fort Lewis, Washington, and found myself assigned to a platoon with two brothers, Pat and Kevin Tillman. And Pat, of course, had gained some notoriety because he gave up, an NFL contract extension in favor of military service, and his brother Kevin, joined him in enlisting, and so we all served in the same platoon together. Kevin and I were in the same squad, so we worked with each other every day, and we trained together as a platoon for some number of months before deploying to Afghanistan in the spring of 2004. Literally 15 years ago now, we would have been in Afghanistan. And then, long story short, April 22nd, 2004, our platoon was ambushed while on patrol on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And a variety of confusing and mitigating circumstances that led up to that point. But when the smoke cleared and it was all said and done, we as a platoon had sustained 4 casualties, 2 dead and 2 wounded. And all of those casualties were, we very quickly found out, were as a result of friendly fire, where one part of the platoon mistakenly believed another part of the platoon was the enemy and treated them as such. And so the 2 guys that were killed, one was as an Afghan fighter who was fighting with us, and the other was Pat. And it was pretty evident, and it became more evident as things evolved. We don't know to this day, who fired the rounds that are responsible for Pat's death, but we do know that, at least based on a number of investigations, that it's probably likely that one of 2 individuals, one of 2 Rangers in his platoon, are responsible for firing those fatal rounds. But again, believing his position to be that of the enemy, and I'm one of those 2 men. And so that was my initiation. That was my first and only firefight, and that's sort of where the story blows open.
Well, blow it open, because that's like, when you I read it and I know the story.
Yeah.
And when you just said it just now, I'm like, holy shit, like that's heavy.
Yeah.
Because on a few different levels. One is, you just said that was your first and only firefight, right? Second, it was friendly fire. And third, you don't know to this day.
No.
Like, there's that unknown there. Like, it's likely.
Or not.
Yeah. And you have no idea.
Yeah.
So blow it open. Like, what happened? What happened after that? Like,
so what happened? Like in the immediate aftermath, it was, we got back to the FOB. There was a couple of investigations. I was told, our squad was told, tell the truth. You're not quote unquote in trouble. They're just trying to understand what happened. You don't have to remember everything. They're not going to expect you to remember everything, but just tell them what you can. And there was no question. Within 24 hours, we knew it was friendly fire. That was not in question within the platoon.
How did you know that? Because of the rounds that were shot, or because of the position? Or
initially, like literally the night, that the following night when we actually moved back to the FOB at night is when I first discovered that there were 50 cal rounds in the rock behind where Pat was killed, and the Taliban doesn't have a 50 cal. But we do. and that weapon was on my vehicle, manned by my gunner. And so immediately at that point, there was the assumption that that it was 50 cal that killed him. So then it was clear to us that, well, wow, it may have been him, but then immediately then you start doing the tumblers and the lock kind of start falling in place, and you say, well, if it could have been him, like I fired where he fired, it could have been me. So literally 24 hours, effectively to almost to the minute, is when that possible realization lands on you, and then you're in a war zone anyway. So you're compartmentalizing a lot, and you have no context for war. It doesn't matter how many times you've watched Black Hawk Down or Saving Private Ryan. You just don't. Because until you get to that moment, you've never actually fired rounds at another human being. But then on top of that, you have no context for the tragedy of friendly fire. That's not supposed to happen. We're Army Rangers. We don't make those sorts of mistakes. As best as you can in your youthful naivety, you prepare yourself. I say prepare yourself. You're aware of the fact that it's a dangerous profession, that you may get hurt, you may not come home. Even though statistically speaking, the training environment is more dangerous than even a war zone, or at least it was at that time.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah, there was more up until that point. Like at that time, there had only been one casualty from 2nd Ranger Battalion, one KIA. There'd been far more KIAs over the years in training accidents, because the training's very realistic, of course. But you prepare yourself for that as best as you can. But what you don't prepare yourself for, and we have no context for, is what happens if I go to war and I am somehow responsible for the harm or death of a comrade, and I'm still alive. What do I do with that? I was somehow prepared, or I thought I was, to not come home. I was prepared to lose my life. I wasn't prepared for, effectively, my life as I knew it to be lost, but for me to physically still be breathing with all my fingers and toes. And so, the shock sets in, and we did the investigations, and then we were back out for another couple of weeks doing missions. It was essentially try to get these guys back on their horse and try and get some, some positive, quote unquote positive, whatever that means in a war zone, some positive action prior to returning home. And then when we returned home, it became very evident. That's when things, really started kind of spiraling out of control, because, unbeknownst to me, there was a wholly different narrative that was being told to the family and to the public. And so,
oh no!
And so we were unaware that there had been, or
like,
at least,
disparaging toward,
or they told.
What were they telling them?
What they were telling them, what was told was that Pat was killed in a hail of glorious gunfire by the enemy. So effectively, then when we got back, pieces started being put together that actually Pat was killed by friendly fire, and that the Army up to that point had told him that he was killed by the enemy. And so then the Army sadly then lost all credibility with the family because of that.
Sure.
And then things changed dramatically, and within a few weeks of getting back, myself and 4 others were effectively dismissed from the Rangers, and that was a surprise, just because we had just been operational, a few weeks prior. So
and that was effectively like a PR move.
I don't know,
like damage control.
It's hard to say, but it definitely you can make the counter argument that keeping us in the unit in Afghanistan was also a PR move. Right. So depending on if you're in the camp that says, those guys, they messed up and they should have been fired, versus those guys were in an unfair situation. I mean, you can come down on, I've spent 15 years trying to figure out, and I've given up. I don't know. I know that I made the wrong choice to fire. It's objectively the wrong choice. I fired at friendlies for lots of reasons that made me believe that it was the enemy position. But at the end of the day, you made a choice that potentially caused harm to other people. And so it's a very messy, just the morality of it, the self-justice of it is just, it's incredibly messy. What responsibility do I have? Is it somebody else's fault? I was just the Joe on the ground put in a situation by a higher commander. This whole desire to try and properly assign guilt and properly assign all of that stuff, it's impossible. I mean, if somebody can do it, I'm welcome. I mean, I'm all ears.
Yeah,
but
sure.
But I can't. And so in any case, it definitely felt like the military was trying to button it up and move on, and that's really hard to do when you've offered something less than the truth. Then everything that comes after that, even if it is true, you've lost credibility, and so they put the family through just so much as a result of that, and so
It probably likely would have been, I imagine, everyone has value. Don't hear me saying that, but it was
yeah,
Pat Tillman.
yeah,
And he was already this hero, right?
Yes.
Like he
Yeah.
he gave up a multi-million-dollar contract with
Yep.
Cardinals to go, fight post 9/11, right?
Yep.
Everything about this scenario was sexy, right?
Yes.
It just was. And so I imagine that if it was Bill Johnson from Paducah, Kentucky,
Right.
this wouldn't really even be a thing.
Yeah, he's
Right.
not the only. I mean, there's 6,000 plus other KIAs in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Right.
and he's not the only fratricide.
Yeah.
I mean, the first dozen or so casualties of the Iraq War were all a mass casualty event from fratricide, friendly fire. So yeah, and that's why I say, even in the preface of the book, if the book is reading, if the story is worth engaging with at all, which I mean, I think it is. I'm biased, but if it is, it's not because the story is unique, but it's precisely because it's ordinary.
Because it's ordinary.
Because if you remove that one single variable, i.e., somebody who played in the NFL,
Sure.
there's nothing about that story that is particularly unusual in terms of people going to war with a certain amount of naivety and with hope for their contribution, and then meeting war head on. And then having to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
That story, whether it happens in a military context, whether it happens in the context of your family, whether it happens in the context of your work, that story gets told every day. That's what happened. I had no context for it. I was happy to leave the regiment, but it was a complete within 4 months of me leaving. That's when sort of the shock began to wear off.
Yeah. So let's
from
talk
all
about that. Let's talk about, so that's spring of 2004, summer of 2004, you're dismissed or let go or whatever the language is.
Yep.
And now you're out, right? You're
Yeah.
back as a civilian, I assume.
No,
right? Or no, did you go back just
Yeah,
in
so I
another-
had
okay.
I still had a 4-year enlistment. And
Sure, yeah.
So I was released. I was released for standards, RFS. That's the Ranger Regiment sort of parlance. And then I was sent to the big army. I was reassigned to be an infantryman at 1st Infantry Division of Fort Riley, Kansas. And then I got diverted because some general in South Carolina wanted a driver who had education, which I had a bachelor's degree, and who had combat experience. Why he wanted those two things to drive him around, I don't know, but
Wild.
That's what he wanted. And so they said, "Do you want to go work for this guy in South Carolina?" And I said, "Sure." So I spent the remaining 2 years on the East Coast working for a 1-star and then a 2-star, which was providential for a variety of reasons, not the least of which there was 2 more investigations that ultimately took place. I think it's hard to say, but that was the beginning of a very dark time in my life. And I'm very grateful for people who were put in my life that kind of helped shepherd me along that path as I was still in uniform.
Yeah. So how did you, let's talk about that. Let's get inside,
Yeah.
The feelings, the emotions, the shock, the stuff going on in your
Yeah.
head. You just said dark, you described it as a dark time. What was that like? And how did you get out of it? Or are you still getting out of
Yeah.
it? Like just talk through that. And then I want to get to what you're doing about it,
Yeah.
right? The Elliott Fund and different things that you're doing. But like, that wasn't happening back then. So how did you get out of it?
Effectively, what began to manifest in me was tremendous amount of guilt, tremendous amount of shame. This whole idea that
I can't even imagine.
I would go to the military and that would be, I'm type A. I was, graduated amongst top of my class in school, and it was, I'm a good doer. You give me a checklist and you tell me how many points I got to get an A, I'll get an A. You know what I mean? That's my personality. And this was the worst possible scenario that I could have imagined in terms of an outcome for my quote unquote contribution to the war effort. And so guilt begins to settle in, shame begins to settle in. I began really exhibiting symptoms of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm not sleeping well, nightmares, hypervigilance, depression, anxiety, medicating with alcohol, which I wasn't a teetotaler, but I just never had any desire to drink prior to that.
Sure.
And so, I became a pretty high-functioning mess. I began doubling down on achievement. It's just like, so while I'm drinking 7 nights a week, working 15 hours a day, I'm working on my MBA online, and I'm getting ready to transition to the civilian world. It's basically, the idea was, whatever I can do, I need to stack up more accomplishment between myself and what happened on April 22nd, 2004. And if I stack up enough accomplishment, then maybe I can outweigh what I did. And in the midst of that as well, you become very angry. I was a Christian going into that, and during the course of particularly those last 2 years that I was in the Army, I walked away from the Lord. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the all-powerful or all-loving conversation. It's saying, your word says that you are both. You are a creator, you are the first mover, you are all-powerful, and you are all-loving. But my evidence and my experience indicates that if you are there, that's how prayers began to be prefaced during that time, is if you are there,
Sure,
you're one or the other. Because what I'm experiencing sure doesn't feel like both. Because why did you allow this to happen? Why did you allow me to be put in that position? Why did you allow me to make that decision? And so ultimately, I blamed God and I walked away, and that didn't help. And so that was the path that I was on for a number of years, where I basically came to the conclusion that I'm a good person, whatever that means, however you want to define that.
Sure.
And I can be a good person, and I don't need the complications of this so-called God, who, when things get really bad, doesn't do what I think he should do to provide the outcome that I think he should provide. So yeah, that was the headspace that I was in for a number of years.
And at what point are you married? You're married?
Yeah. So I met my wife. We went on our first date within a month of me getting back from Afghanistan. And it was during the course of that date that I told her what happened, just because at that time, which is, sounds super weird. It was pretty normal. Just because, we sensed a connection pretty instantly. And I knew that my future was very uncertain based on what happened. So it felt like at that point it would have been a lie of omission not to say, hey, this is super strange, and I don't even know how to tell you this, but she knew I was a Ranger and all that. But so that was from the outset of our relationship, and then we got married while we were having a long distance relationship the following year in 2005, and then I got out in 2007. Believing that, hey, once I get out of this uniform, and I get a fresh start as a civilian, which I did, got a great job as a wealth manager at a big firm, then the Army's the problem. I'm not the problem. The Army's the problem. Once I can put this to rest and get into a new narrative, then these problems will go away. And turns out that wasn't true. So we had lived the first couple of years of our marriage really apart, and she didn't really know at all the extent to which I was self-medicating. She didn't know the extent to which I was suffering those symptoms. And so I came back in 2007, and then financial crisis happens, and I was blessed throughout that. The Lord was really faithful to us throughout all of that. But then turns out the Army wasn't the problem. And then by 2009, we found ourselves separating and filing divorce papers because I was essentially an isolated, self-medicating mess that knew how to tie a tie and knew how to put on the image that I needed to put on. But inside, I was just a guilt, shame-ridden, God-hating person.
So did you guys go through with the divorce?
Yeah, we were divorced in end of 2009.
Okay.
So, and then during that process is when, the Lord was working throughout all of that, but that was certainly a time where I began to seek help. I didn't even have a context for what I had. I saw a counselor a few times when I was in the military, and I had a piece of paper that said I had post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't know what that meant, I had a prescription for Zoloft in my hand that I never took because that would have required me not drinking alcohol, and that was hilarious.
And that wasn't going to happen.
That wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's just like, you've got your goofy medicine. I don't know what that's going to do. At least I know what this is going to do, and so that was kind of where we found ourselves. And then during that separation period and divorce period, I started turning back to the Lord and hitting bottom in that regard. And then in 2010, we remarried.
Wow.
And so that's in the book.
Wow. Yeah.
That whole trajectory is there for sure. But that was, I wouldn't say there isn't a single turning point. There are a number of waypoints in the journey where you can say, this was a turn back towards the right azimuth, back towards the right heading. And that separation and divorce period was certainly one of those times.
That sums up most people's lives though, right? Like we want there to be this big moment. Yep. And in reality, that might happen for some people in certain circumstances, but by and large, it's these little things that happen, right? Yeah. It's little things that keep like nudging us in the direction that we should go, right? And then we try to like get off again, and then it nudges us back, and whatever, faith or not faith, people know what that feels like, right? For their deity or somebody in their life, like pushing them. And it's little things. It's not this like, usually this angel appears to you and tells you go here, right? Or whatever. That doesn't happen a ton. So 3 days ago was April 22nd.
Yeah.
What happens every year on that date for you? Because that was 3 days ago was 15 years since April 22nd, 2004.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, initially for the first number of years, particularly when I was still really sick, it was, and I'd heard that, it's just like, anniversary dates, kind of like, be careful. And I was sort of like, F that, like, stupid.
Yeah.
Like, it cognitively didn't make sense to me, which is just like, I don't think you could have a greater demonstration of pride than to say that, well, if I don't think it makes sense, then it doesn't apply. And it's just like, anyway.
It's a very type A thing to do. And I'm pointing to myself.
Yeah, it is. But the reality is they matter. And so, there was a number of, it was, I was already reliving, a lot of my experiences anyway. And so, anniversary dates were really hard for a number of years. And, now kind of on the other side of a lot of healing that's taken place, we don't pop a champagne cork and go to the beach. You know what I mean? Like it's not, it's heavy.
Yeah.
You remember, I connect and, reach out with folks who, one particular individual who was in the platoon, we always usually connect on that day, and you remember. But now it's more of a reminder for really what the Lord has done in my own heart and in my own life, and it's more of a reminder of what that day can possibly mean in terms of taking steps forward. So I think that's consistent with the Gospels. It's consistent with the heart of Jesus, that is the suffering servant. It's not that we're supposed to move beyond suffering to the point to where it's forgotten, and to the point to which we don't have scars. Jesus, when he walked around the earth after his resurrection, he kept his scars. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to that. Not to say that we become identified by our darkest places. That's not who we are. But it also means that we don't have to sweep those under the rug.
We shouldn't ignore it.
We shouldn't ignore it. And so it's a both and reality where we can remember without being pulled back into the darkness of those moments. And so it's mainly just, like 2 days, whenever it was, 22nd, my 17-year-old daughter and I were flying, here to Nashville for a conference. And a lot of it is it's frankly just every year over the last 5 years, it just becomes more surreal because of how of just all the garbage that we went through, and how bad it was for so many years. So then it's just like you're sitting on a plane with my daughter, who I almost didn't have much of a relationship with because of choices that I was making and pain that I was experiencing. And here we are together doing this thing.
Yeah.
So it becomes sort of more of like a kind of a pinch yourself moment, where it's just like, I would not have guessed this, and don't deserve this, and you're grateful for what you have, knowing that Pat's gone, knowing that a lot of other people have suffered as well, and so it's a both and. It's we're grateful we're here and we have the chance to do what we can do with whatever time we're given, and also a time of remembrance for what's been lost.
So there's obviously so many parts of your story that you didn't tell me that are in the book.
Uh-huh.
Everybody get the book.
Yeah.
Did I mention we should get the book? but so let's talk about the Elliott Fund now.
Yeah.
Right. So all of your, just wild things have happened, and your ups and your downs and your highs and your lows since, leaving the military and, almost you're losing your marriage and then getting it back and the kid, all the stuff. Right.
Yeah.
And now you've started the Elliott Fund. So let's
Yeah.
talk Elliott Fund. Let's talk veterans. Let's talk VA. Let's talk PTSD.
Yes.
What are you trying to do about it now?
Yeah. So the Elliott Fund was started initially just as a pass-through organization because one thing we felt in writing the book was that if there was any financial proceeds from the book, we wanted to redirect those to other organizations that are doing good work. I didn't need to recreate the wheel and do something that somebody else is already doing.
Totally.
So
Which
it's
is
just
very
like,
awesome of you, because I come from the nonprofit world
Yeah.
where everybody's trying to start their new thing. And
Yeah.
it's like, but now they don't have because you're taking
Exactly. And so, and I don't, other than it's strange because you have a very granular experience having, been a soldier, but at the same time, I'm not a clinician. I don't have a 30,000 foot view. So the real question is, how do we put our story, a story that is not unique, but every story is unique in its own way, that can be perhaps an on-ramp to understanding the issues and how we can actually meaningfully move the needle forward with respect to how do we view and how do we treat the unseen wounds of war. Because so much of my journey and so much of my pain was self-imposed, both in terms of my broken understanding of masculinity, my broken understanding of what somebody who experienced war trauma was, because I viewed it very binary. Either you are an alpha male warrior and you can deal with the consequences of your military service, or you're weak, and I'm not the latter, right? I refuse to be the latter. And we don't have a good grasp of the spectrum of, spiritual and mental health that is the absolute reality, right?
Yeah.
Just like at any given point in the day or week, we're maybe all over the place with our physical health. Well, the same is true with other elements of our being. And so that's the broad question. I had unseen wounds that effectively went untreated for years. It would have been the equivalent of I got a gunshot wound in April of 2004, covered it up, and then 5 years later, in the midst of divorce, I start unpacking it and figuring out what's even there. So you can imagine you have the wound, but then you have all the other things that you have to deal with because the wound has been untreated. And so, just forget war trauma. If you eat nothing but pastry, coffee, and cup of noodles and then wash it down with a bottle of wine every night, you're going to feel like garbage.
Yeah.
Your diet deteriorates, your sleep deteriorates, like all of these really basic things that do not contribute to your health, and so on and so forth. So what we're doing with the Elliott Fund is, one, it's a conduit to whatever extent there's book financial proceeds, we're going to pass those on to other organizations who are doing good work in that space. It's also a platform for reform. So we've identified with partner organizations what we believe are 17 corrective actions for active duty military mental health. A lot of attention gets paid to the VA, rightly so, because that's when the problems really begin to manifest. But one thing that every part of the VA or every service member who is in the VA has in common is that they were once an active duty service member. And to the extent that they have wounds that are now trying to be treated within a VA environment, those wounds were generally incurred while they were on active duty. So just like the gunshot wound analogy, imagine if the active duty component didn't treat that wound at all, and then 5 years later the VA gets to deal with that. Well, that's not going to be a very good scenario. We have the ability to have care at the point of trauma and woundedness, a spectrum of care that's appropriate, right? And so we've identified 17 corrective actions that we're now having some conversations with policy makers, which is exciting because our whole approach is collaborative. Congress is not the enemy. The DoD is not the enemy. Nobody wants there to be 22 plus service members taking their lives every day as a result of untreated mental illness. So if we can all agree that we don't want that to happen, how do we collaboratively move forward to create and improve systems in the active duty component before they metastasize and become something far worse. And so we're hoping that War Story can be just a catalyst for that awareness and for that change. Because I think everybody gets, I don't say everybody, but I think our society is well aware of the fact that there is this mental health thing going on, that war is not good for the soul. And so this is not about awareness. If you're not aware, awesome. Definitely read the book, and we invite you into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
But this is about how do we take that and actually move forward into reform. And that doesn't mean tearing down systems to the ground and starting over. We have made, as a society, so much progress over a generation. Post-traumatic stress wasn't even a diagnosis in Vietnam.
Sure.
And so, my generation of veterans, we have people tripping over themselves telling us, thank you for your service, versus, versus what the Vietnam generation faced. So we, in many respects, we stand on their shoulders, and we want to take the next step in that process. It's not confined. It's no different. I mean, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, wounds of the spirit, those are not confined to people who wear a uniform or go to war on behalf of a nation. We've got a lot of broken and hurting people. And so however our story and however those lessons from how the military engages with that, however that can be used, we're all in favor of that. And really it boils down to, it's a cultural change. You can't just nail your 10 corporate values on the wall and expect that to actually live.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, we as a people, as humans, have to find peace telling our own stories, whatever those are, because the single biggest lie that we are told is that you're alone. Nobody could understand you, and if they knew you, they'd hate you and they'd reject you. And that is just the biggest lie. And that separation, it causes breakdowns in family, breakdowns in community, and it's so tragic because so often, and we've probably all experienced that, where you feel that fear, and then somehow that's broken through, and you realize that you're surrounded by people who absolutely understand and or have been through a lot of the same things that you have. And so, our hope is that just by even telling the story, that we can help make it safer in the right way for people to not be trapped in that lie. That's what the Elliott Fund is about, practically, and that's what really the hope of War Story is to put it in service of that.
Thanks for sharing that. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you.
Of course.
I want to learn from you. I mean, I've been learning from you the whole time, but I don't have a story like yours. Yeah. Nobody that I know in my immediate family, and even my sort of extended family, was active duty, right? Yeah. So it just wasn't part of my, when 9/11 happened, I was living in Guatemala. No part of me was like, even though I was old enough to, no part of me was thinking, well, that's how I'm going to serve. I thought of different ways, and Absolutely. I'm known within my sort of circles as, that, like, the pacifist guy, right? Like, and I've never owned a gun. I never will. I have a bunch of my friends that think I'm like a shitty father because I won't have a gun in my home. Yeah. And I have my reasons for that. Absolutely. I think a lot of my friends who shoot guns in their backyards would have an interesting conversation with you or with other people saying, like, you don't even know what happens to you. Even if it's in self-defense, like, you don't know what happens to you when you point a gun at somebody. That's right. You pull the trigger, you kill them. That's right. Like, even if you saved your family's lives, like, that will haunt you for the rest of your life, right? And so I don't come from, the family you had, where your grandfather, amazing, like, it's amazing. He served in, World War II and all of that. That's just not my context. Of course, right? Yeah. So here we are, 2019. I don't even know where you are politically, so we won't get into that per se. But, a while back, Trump had promised he's going to bring spending down 5%, right? Yeah. From, I think, 716 to 702 billion or whatever. Right. And just recently he asked for it to go up to 750. Yeah. So we have 800 military bases around the world. Not like huge bases, but some of them are small, but 800, we're all over, as compared to, like, I think I wrote it down, Britain, France, and Russia combined have 30.
Yeah.
and we have 800, right? It seems growing up outside the US, then coming back as an adult to
Yep.
live here, I've just observed a country that seems obsessed with violence and war. I mean, if you look back at our history, there's only been a couple dozen years that we haven't been at war about something, right? Like we've been at war our entire existence as a country, right? And yeah, like you said, and I think that's a fine thing. I think that's a fine thing, but people almost they think you're a better person because you served in the military than my mailman, or
That's right.
the Miss Pleasant who teaches my daughter at school, or the guy that runs the company. Like you're doing different things.
Yeah.
And obviously I think having a military is a good thing. Every country needs to be protected. But I personally think we're at just a ridiculous level of whatever that version is, right?
Yeah.
And so what's your response to me on that? Like, what do you say to that? Am I off base? Do we need to have the size military we have right now? Does it need to grow as our current administration is saying that it, should? Just, speak to me. Because you've said multiple times you're a different person than you were back then, where you felt like you had something to prove.
Yeah.
And there was two options in your mind: be the alpha male that goes and fights, or be weak.
That's
like
right.
Those are the only two options. Like, is that you today? How have you transformed? What do you think about our current military sort of structure in the US right now, where we currently are? Most of my listeners are in the US.
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly wouldn't purport to be an expert on, global threat assessments and, how we do that. I know you're not asking that, but, I want to be real careful to, speak within my own competencies, observations. I think in general, whether you're an individual, a corporation, a nonprofit, a company, a government, good decisions generally don't get made from places of fear. And it feels like we've been operating primarily from a place of fear since Pearl Harbor. It's not to say there was obviously a legitimate threat that we needed to respond to during World War II,
for sure,
and all of that. But it's interesting that for a country and a people that have so much strength, strength is never best expressed within the context of fear, and it feels like we're afraid a lot. And I think that in general does not lead us to a place of good decisions. And I think that I absolutely question, I look at, my deployment to Afghanistan, and I don't know what that was for, in terms of how are we a safer people because of that. I think that the desire in many respects, we as a country have been trying to export a democracy and a value system that we don't even practice here.
100%.
So, and we continue to try and solve non-military problems with military solutions. So regardless of somebody's intent, you're an infantry captain, going to Afghanistan, you're a warrior. You're trained to direct trigger pullers. And now you're asked to effectively operate as a diplomat within a tribal region where you don't know the culture, you don't know the language, and in 6 to 12 months, you're going to be back in the States. And so I feel for, and I know there's a lot of people in uniform, they feel so strongly, as they should, about wanting to help people who don't have what we have.
Totally.
And I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that we just have to be really careful. Our military is one tool in the toolbox, and it seems to be a tool that we go to far too often.
Come on. Yeah.
And I think that we have to consider both, precisely because I am fiercely pro-military, that we have to really be careful how we use that very precious tool, because I think we've done a tremendous amount of damage, and there's so much residual harm that comes from putting people in situations that they weren't meant to be put into, and using that tool in ways that aren't efficient, and playing to fears that are probably grounded in reality. It's not that there aren't terrorist organizations who would be happy to do harm to Americans. Of course there are. But those fears can be used, I think, to consolidate power. They've always been used to do that throughout history by creating otherism.
Yep.
The easiest way to unite a people is to find a common enemy. And are there enemies that we have to be vigilant for? And do we need to have a robust military? Of course. And what the budget number is in order to have that, I don't know. But I think that there's a lot of underlying motivations, i.e., fear, being one of the biggest ones. That is actually a tremendous expression of weakness. It's so ironic because it poses as this, chest thumping position of strength. Strongest people in the world, they don't have to prove that they are.
100%.
And so I think we've
we're very much in that chest thumping mode, aren't we?
Yeah.
So if they, whoever they is, called you up tomorrow and said, "We need you to come in and fix shit. Like, come in and fix things. We need you to be our president," whatever. If that happened to you,
we would be in dire straits.
We'd be in a different set of problems. But I like what you just described, that balance, right? I feel like that's a healthy balance.
Yeah.
Where you said, I'm fiercely pro-military, and we're probably doing it poorly, right?
Yeah.
We are acting out of fear. That is 1,000% evident, right? Like, what would you, in this political climate, in this societal climate, and if you don't have an answer that you think you want to share, that's fine. I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I think you could probably come up with something. Like, given our current political, societal climate, our current threats that we do know about outside the U.S., what would you do to unite the American people? Because, like, things are coming out. I don't have all the context, so I might be screwing this up a little bit, but it was this whole story right now about the military chief that his subordinates were told not to say anything because he, like, was killing.
SEAL Team 7. I think.
So here's, like, this high ranking, right? That is now reported, like, sniper rifled this girl's head off, like, just because she was wearing a hijab, right? And then the kid that was, like, injured, and he killed him, and, like, there's that going on, right? Where you have that dynamic where, like, that's not okay, no matter what you think about all of this.
Yeah.
Like, that's not okay. And you have all these different stories, and it's easy to become so, like, enraged and say, well, it's easy for me, honestly, coming from where I come as a more, like, progressive person who does follow Jesus as a Christian, but definitely has a more progressive view on things. And I generally try to take care of things, and I try not to act out of fear. I try to take care of things in a more, like, pacifistic kind of way. It's easier for me to look at that and become very enraged and say, like, fuck all of that.
Yeah.
Like, that is not the way.
That's right.
And so then I make the military the enemy. And the military is it's a vital part of our society to protect us from the actual enemy, right? So what would you, I know that was a lot of just, like, verbal vomiting, but, like, what would you do to unite people and to get, kind of pass on your balanced perspective, communicate that to the very divided American population right now?
As a completely theoretical, non-policy sort of conversation, it's maybe easier to answer that question. I would answer it in two ways. One is recalling gospel context, and then two, just even an experience that my daughter and I had 2 nights ago here in Nashville. The first is just, it's so interesting to look at how Jesus interacted with what was effectively the Nazi empire of his time, and it's not to in any way conflate or diminish that was an incredibly evil regime that existed during the 1930s and 40s. But the Roman Empire, they were not objectively the good guys to the Jews, and Jesus was a Jew. And you can't find in the Gospels that he said one bad thing about a Roman soldier or a centurion. His message very much against the hopes and wishes of his disciples was not a political message. It was a message of the kingdom is here, and the kingdom is not of this world. It's a kingdom of the heart. And so that's so powerful because it means that the kingdom of heaven can invade and reign literally in any political dynamic, to include when your people are occupied by a foreign military power like the Romans. So it's so interesting to your point of not being anti-military. I mean, we have examples of Jesus, healing the centurion's servant. His response to the centurion, you can almost feel this relief where Jesus says, finally, somebody who understands the nature of authority. You get it. because you're a man in authority. When you say go, people go. When you say come, they come. And Jesus is like, that's me. You get it. And so it's just so fascinating to me just to think about just how Jesus approached everybody. And the problem is not, it has never been the Republican Party or the Libertarian Party or the Progressive Party or the Democratic Party, and we fight and die on those hills all day long. The problems and the battlefield is in the heart and mind of every human being. And until we embrace that, until we recognize that I can be just as much a part of the problem and dysfunction in the conversation as the other, whoever the other is, then we will just continue to fall into these feedback loops and two camps, whatever those two camps are. And so I think, particularly as followers of Jesus, we have to remember that and not conflate any legal document or any earthly system, even if that earthly system, like our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, is imbued with ideas of the divine and ideas of God-given rights. It's not the kingdom of heaven. The Declaration of Independence is not the kingdom of heaven. That is not the highest thing that we can aspire to. The highest thing that we can aspire to is to love God and love our fellow man. That's what Jesus calls us to do. That's the sum total of the law. That's it. And so that is both, that's almost too simple. Can't be that simple. But in reality, that's really hard, because some days I don't like myself, and a lot of days I definitely don't like whoever the other is.
Sure.
And they're the problem. So I think it's a problem of context. But second, if I could do just one thing and institute a policy of in this day and age, I would force people to eat together and share meals together. So we had there's a
that
restaurant.
Works, dude.
There's a restaurant down the street here. My daughter and I, 2 nights ago, we were hungry. We walked by it here in Nashville, and Southern comfort food, sold. Let's go eat. Well, we didn't realize that it's family-style dining, meaning they bring all the dishes out to you, and you serve yourself just like you're at somebody's dinner table. But it's family-style dining at big tables where you get seated with whomever else is there. And so we didn't know that. And first of all, we're being seated with a bus driver who's a Nashvilleian his whole life. And at first we were just like, why are you following us to our table? And then we sort of slowly realized,
you figured it out.
Oh, and then 3 more people are seated at our table, and they have the same look of confusion in their eyes, from North Carolina and Atlanta. And then 2 other people come and sit down, and we're all like slowly. It was funny because other than Bill, who I think eats there 2 or 3 nights a week, and he's telling us how it works. Pass to the left, pass the sweet tea and whatever else. All 3, you could all see these 3 different groups of people, about 7 of us, who were just confused. And we had conversation and interaction and commonality with people that we would have never have had. And people will hear that. I'm sure some people will hear that and just roll their eyes and say, "That's cute. That's nice. Wish it was all that simple." But what are you going to do about Hillary? What are you going to do about Nancy Pelosi? What are you going to do about Donald Trump? You need to ground yourself in the real world. The real world is all of us need to eat. All of us have need. All of us were once kids. All of us have brokenness, and we tend to operate out of those places of brokenness. And so I think we would do well to put down our phones, shut off Netflix, and log off of social media for 30 to 45 minutes and break bread with other humans. And instead of starting from a place of all of our disagreements, start from the basic place of what our common need is of nourishment, and see what happens.
Yes, that is something that my family and I do. We're trying to do it much better. We've always done it pretty well. We've always brought people together over food. The last couple years, it's been more focused on trying to do the hard thing, because it is hard, of getting people that we know we fundamentally disagree on certain things with around our table. It's super easy to say, hey pals, come on over for food and drinks.
Right.
And then we're going to go out back and smoke cigars together. Like, that's easy.
Right.
That's easy.
Right.
Like, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
But when it's somebody that you're like, oh, I know you voted for him or her.
That's right.
And I do not like that. Come on over.
That's exactly right.
And a couple things come to mind. One is I just saw this social media post that's getting shared around. These couple of black guys that were sitting at a restaurant that invited an elderly white woman over to eat with them.
That's awesome.
And that was like big news. And A, that is big news.
Right.
But B, it shouldn't be big news.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That because people were just like, it was just a stunning thing for people to see. Like, you just wouldn't think that they would invite her over, right? And that just shouldn't be a thing.
Right. That's right. It shouldn't.
And then 2, I did this thing with some friends a few months back where around the table we had a bunch of people, some that I knew more than others. To my right was my buddy Binyad Sharif, who lives here. He's a Kurd, Iraqi Muslim refugee. His family, they were caught in the Cairo airport coming over on Muslim ban day.
Wow.
Whenever that Muslim ban went into effect, they got stopped at the Cairo airport, got sent back after years of trying to get here. So they finally made it. Wonderful family. And then there's conservatives. There's people who voted for Trump. There's all everybody. We have liberals, progressives, conservatives, libertarians, and everybody. And you know what? None of that mattered at the table.
Yeah.
None of that mattered for 3, 4. I mean, it went way later. I actually had to bump a meeting. I had this late meeting for some reason at 11 p.m. that night. And we had to bump the 11 o'clock meeting from supper time because it just went.
Wow.
And it was beautiful. That needs to happen more because when you realize that you might have voted for him or her, but you're not a bigot, a racist, a xenophobe. Your kids have to go to soccer practice. My kids have to go to soccer practice. Let's go to soccer practice.
That's right.
Oh, you guys are going on vacation. Why don't you come to vacation with us? That is a wonderful thing to force people to do.
Yeah.
If you were ever put in the position of becoming, we just got to do more of that stuff, dude.
Yeah, I agree.
Pro-military, anti-military, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro whoever the next president's going to be, anti whoever the next president's going to be. We all have so much in common.
Yeah.
What I've tried to remind myself in the last 3 years is that everybody knows where I stand politically on this podcast. But just to remind myself that there are 1,000,001 things that Trump or any leader, they can never touch.
That's right.
There's 1,000,000 things that I can do and do every day and that I'll do tomorrow and the next day that they just have no say over.
Yeah.
Those are the things I have control over. Those are Let's Give a Damn is completely built on the premise of if everybody does these small things each and every day, we get somewhere.
Yeah,
It's not these big things. Going back to a lot of times there's no big turning point. It's these small little things. It's all these small little acts that build up, that change a place.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, let's begin to wrap this up. We've been going on. Here's the last big question. Someday, many years from now, you're going to die. Hopefully it's many, many years from now. But on that day, hypothetically, I'm asked to give your eulogy. So your family, your friends, people that you have loved and served through your book or books at that point, the Elliott Fund, all the work you've done, they're all there to celebrate and mourn your life. What do you hope that I would say about you on that day?
I think I would just hope that I was known as somebody who followed Jesus and who did their best to love people in the way that he's loved me. That's what I hope I would be known for.
Awesome. Great legacy. One last one that I'm just thinking about because of the trauma that you've been through and the things that you've gone through. If you 3 days ago, April 22nd, 2019, Stephen could go back and talk to April 22nd, 2005. But after
the anniversary.
I'm thinking after. I'm thinking you've now been, reassigned. It's a whole new thing. You're dealing with all the stuff you've already talked about. What would you communicate to Stephen April 22nd, 2005?
I would tell him to give up and say, stop trying to do it on your own. Stop trying to isolate. That your guilt and shame, to whatever extent that was rightly ascribed, in many respects isn't that special. There's a strange amount of pride that can get wrapped around our pain and around our failures, where we begin to believe that we're in fact unique or special in our brokenness, which we're not that original in terms of our ways in which we're fallen. And I would have told him that you are loved, and at the same time, you're not that special, and it's going to be okay. And that the more people you invite into this story and this absolute disaster, the easier it's going to be. And frankly, the more people that might actually be helped as a result of it. And so something maybe along those lines is what I would have said.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So May 21, War Story comes out.
Yes.
You get it on Amazon. You can pre-order now.
You can.
I'll have all the links for Elliott Fund, for the book, everything in the show notes. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, Nick.
This was fun.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening in, friends. Wild story, right? While recording, there were a few times where I didn't have much to say in response to things he said because I was overwhelmed by the immensity and intensity of parts of his story. And if you know me, you know it's very rare that I lack anything to say. Please visit theelliottfund.org for articles, books, videos, and other resources you can use to become an advocate for those serving in our military. And buy Stephen's forthcoming book, War Story, a Memoir, on or before May 21 on Amazon, or pre-order it from your local library. And if you're like me and you don't usually read things like this, I know you'll still enjoy it and be challenged by it. You can find links and more information on this podcast conversation and Let's Give a Damn in general by going to letsgiveadamn.com. If you love what we're doing on the show, please tell a friend, or leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, or consider throwing a few dollars our way each month to support the production and execution of the show by visiting patreon.com/letsgiveadamn. This podcast episode was produced by yours truly and the fantastic Chad Snavely. The music is by The Amazing Propaganda. Make sure to check out all his music on Spotify or wherever you listen to your music. Can't wait to spend time with you next week. Love y'all. Peace.